Minister Stephen Harper has unveiled plans to clamp down on drivers who are high on drugs. Harper says the criminal code will be amended to give police more powers to apprehend and test drug-impaired drivers, also increase penalties and promote awareness of the problem. There is currently no foolproof scientific test in Canada to determine what drug a driver may have consumed. Now, Mothers Against Drunk Driving says that problem's been eliminated in the United States with the introduction of a series of tests that looks for families of drugs. Is today's announcement a welcome change to the criminal code, or is it an infringement on our civil rights? Joining us to discuss this development from outside the City of Hamilton Police Services building is Deputy Chief Ken Leendurst, and here in our studio, Defense Attorney Jeffrey Reed.
Hi, Mark.
How you doing? We'll get to you in a second, Jeff, but first let's talk to Ken. How will this, in your opinion, how will this change affect the way police do their job? Will it make it more difficult? And do you believe that we will be able to get impaired drivers, not alcohol-impaired drivers, but drug-impaired drivers off the roads?
Well, Mark, I think that's a great idea. Any time that the government can give the police service more tools to make our roads safer, it's a great idea. I mean, although it's going to be a lot of work and it's going to be taxing, because with this comes a lot of responsibility and a lot of additional training.
Right, Jeff.
Ken, how is it going to work, though? Are they going to take a blood sample? How does it work?
Well, the new legislation, first of all, makes it gives us the powers to give these field tests. Right now, when we stop an impaired driver, you know, we get them to touch their nose, we get them to walk the line, but there's nothing in legislation that says that they have to do that. Also, of course, for an impaired driver, all we need to know is if they've been drinking, and that allows us to do roadside screening. But what this legislation does is it allows us to use the field test to see if, in fact, we have evidence that shows that someone was, of course, impaired by a drug. And that's our first step to give us the grounds, and then we move in to get the experts to examine the person.
Okay, Jeff, this is going to pose a number of problems from your standpoint, is it not?
It sure is. The first problem is going to be, what kind of tests are they going to be? Are they going to be very intrusive? The second is, what kind of delays are they going to involve? Because if they involve any kind of a delay of any significance, the next thing is going to be there's going to be a right to counsel, which is going to lead to further problems. Third thing is, even if you show that there's some possible presence of a drug, how are you going to show that there's an impairment due to that drug? Now, obviously, right now, under the criminal code, a police officer can ask for consent from somebody who's capable of providing consent to get a blood sample, but then that's got its own problems, because you have to go to a qualified medical practitioner who has to be satisfied that it won't endanger the person in order to give it. So there's a problem. Interestingly enough, though, the legislation right now only provides that the police officer can ask for that consent for a blood sample if they think it's a drinking and driving offense, as opposed to a, quote, drugging, unquote, and driving offense, although the offense itself is impaired by reason of a drug or alcohol. So I would really like to know what kind of tests they're going to use, what's the scientific basis of them, how reliable have they been shown, how many false positives are they going to show, and how intrusive are they going to be?
Spoken like a defense attorney, I'll tell you. Ken, I was going to say, if a person is impaired, for example, if you said that you stop a vehicle and ask them to walk the line and they're falling off the line, you know, Jeff, isn't that grounds to say this guy shouldn't be behind, or this woman shouldn't be behind the wheels, and we should get a test to determine whether or not they are indeed impaired?
Well, actually, I just got to add one other thing. Under the Highway Traffic Act, police officers can, in fact, demand compliance with sobriety tests, roadside sobriety tests. So they can now already do some of those things. The question is, what kind of tests can they employ, and could it involve, for example, some sort of maybe taking saliva samples or so forth? We don't know, because we don't know what kind of testing they're going to use. But that's what the police officer does use, and quite properly, too, to give them a better idea about whether there really is a problem with impairment. And then, of course, if it's just going to be an impaired charge, that's all it is. But typically it leads to offer grounds for a demand for a breath sample, and then you're off to the police station. Right. That's where they don't use the alco-tester right on the scene in order to try and take a quick measure and see if you're over 0.1 in order to see if there's a possibility that you're over the legal limit.
Well, there you go, Ken. Jeff's not in favor of it.
I don't even need to argue it. Jeff's got a lot of the points, which is important. The first thing the officers find is a person's ability to drive is impaired. So we've got all kinds of evidence, either driving evidence, or they're found asleep, or they're incoherent. And so our next step is, if it's not by alcohol, it must be by drug. And so what the legislation allows us to do is use standardized tools, standardized tests to form the grounds. Now what happens is once we form the grounds, we don't know what kind of drug it is. It could be glue, it could be marijuana, it could be LSD.
It could be a prescription drug, couldn't it, Ken?
Well, it could be a prescription drug. And the idea is to make a road safer. And so we're going to have these drugs experts that will be able to, that are going to be fully trained. There are breath techs that will be fully trained that will go through scientific testing. Now, it's a lot of training that needs to be done, but they'll be able to form grounds to say, to add to the frontline officer and say, yes, in fact, this person was impaired by drugs. Now, Jeff also touched on the third part of the legislation that allows us to now demand samples, be it samples of urine or saliva. But, you know, there's still, our hope is that we eventually get to the tools that are out there, and we're asking science to provide the tools. So it's similar to that of an alka-tester or a roadside screening device, that the officer from the front line can use this tool and be able to determine, is the person under the influence of a drug.
You said the tools exist today?
Pardon?
Do these tools exist today?
The tools do not exist. They did for impaired. I mean, if you look at the criminal code and all the case law, I mean, most of the case law comes from impaired driving, because there's so many arguments about constitutions and a person's rights, and of course holding the person and not allowing them to have their lawyer. So I mean, there's a lot of things that have to be worked out before this happens. But if we can be provided the tools, and it's going to require some research, but we can be provided the tools that show that someone's impaired through marijuana or alcohol, or even help us identify the drug, that's going to add to helping us prove the case.
But Ken, can you, in all honesty, can you take a roadside test, and if you suspect someone has smoked too much marijuana or has smoked marijuana, period, if the guy walks a straight line and can touch his finger to his nose and can count backwards from 100 or whatever, can you make that determination and say, well, we know you've been smoking, but you're not impaired, so it's okay? The word impaired is can be a pretty gray area, right?
Well, and that's why all the legislation has gone to, you know, 0.08 of alcohol, because the scientists have said when you're at this point of impairment, that's when, of course, you shouldn't be driving. It's going to be more difficult because there is no tests that say, you know, if you smoke 20 joints, you shouldn't be driving.
Right.
I think that's why it's going to have to be tied to the officer's testimony and observations, that the person's weaving all over the road, the person's driven into a building, the person, you stop the car and the person rolls out of the car. I mean, add that to the evidence that, in fact, this person has consumed drugs, and I think you have a good case.
Jeff,
okay,
last word to you. I was just going to say, Jeff, last word to you. Do you think it's going to go through?
Mark, could I just add one thing?
Yes, you got about 15 seconds.
Okay. It sounds like the Minister of Justice has said, we're going to give you some tools to do what these things are, but we don't know what the tools are yet. So I think right now it's going to lead to a real quagmire of litigation, where you're going to have police officers giving opinions, no doubt in good faith and with some training, and all kinds of competing opinions being given. It's going to lead to a lot of litigation unless some really capable, simple, reliable tools are provided. We just don't know what they are.
Right.
The Attorney General said, we're going to give you the tools, but we haven't told you what they are.
Okay, in the meantime, sorry Ken, I think we all agree we want to make sure all impaired drivers are off the road. Let's start by educating, let's hope the tools work, and let's hope from a legal, constitutional standpoint that nobody's getting their toes stepped on. Thanks so much to Ken Leendernst and to Jeff Reed for joining us.
Mark, Donna,
appreciate it.
Ken.
Alcohol on your breath when they stop you in future ride spot checks. The Prime Minister says he wants to give them the power to crack down on drivers impaired by drugs. CH's Al Sweeney has more.
Prime Minister Stephen Harper kicked off this year's annual Red Ribbon campaign for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And he said he's going to give police a whole new series of weapons in the fight to get impaired drivers off the road.
I'm pleased to announce that Canada's new government will introduce legislation to tackle drug-impaired driving when Parliament returns from its break week.
Harper says drinking and driving isn't the only problem, and he's going to change the law so that police can go after drivers who are impaired by taking drugs.
Any time that the government can give the police service more tools to make our roads safer, it's a great idea.
But others are saying, wait a minute.
Sounds like the Minister of Justice has said, we're going to give you some tools to do what these things are, but we don't know what the tools are yet. So I think...
On CH's Live at 5:30, defense lawyer Jeff Reed said testing for drugs won't be as easy as blowing into a breath monitor for alcohol.
I would really like to know what kind of tests they're going to use, what's the scientific basis of them, how reliable have they been shown, how many false positives are they going to show, and how intrusive are they going to be.
Cannabis does not cause that carnage that alcohol causes.
Okay. And Alison Mearden, who uses medical marijuana to treat her multiple sclerosis symptoms, says the plan would violate the Charter of Rights because tests could find cannabis from marijuana in someone's system long after they've used it.
The way they test it would be unfair to those who are smoking cannabis because cannabis will show up many months later. Cannabis shows up after months and months.
Police admit there's a lot to be worked out in Harper's plan and say it's up to science to give them the tests to do the job. Al Sweeney, CH News, Hamilton.